Story 1. The house my grandparents lived in had a decorative G above the garage. I was 20 when I realized it represented their last name and was not for grandma, as I had thought since I was a little girl. Story 2. I recently found out that my 32-year-old husband has been telling people that his wife is a really big fascist. Come to find out, he has thought since childhood that it was a term for someone who is into fashion. Story 3. Gargling with warm water and salt helps soothe a sore throat, and it wasn't just my mom pushing a placebo on me. Story 4. When I was a child, my mother told me that if I pulled the fire alarm, it would spray ink on me so that the fire department would know who activated it. That kept me from ever using it as a prank. Fast forward to when I was 26. I was in graduate school and happened to be present when someone was conducting a fire safety drill. They asked if I wanted to pull the handle. I promptly replied that I had on a new shirt I didn't want to get ink on. They looked at me as if I had 3 heads. After learning the truth, we all had a good laugh in the end. I called my parents immediately afterward to share the story. They were laughing hard. Edit/update. It turns out there's a kernel of truth hidden in there, thanks to those who mentioned that there is a form of ultraviolet ink. My mother described a picture of jet black ink squirting directly out at you like a water gun. I'm glad so many can relate. Just make sure whatever you do, you don't turn on the overhead light in the back of the car because that's illegal, and law enforcement will definitely pull you over for it. Story 5. I am a non-native English speaker, and for 25 years, I thought awful was more positive than awesome, like a combination of awesome and beautiful. This is your wife and she's pregnant? Wow, that's so awesome, man. Story 6. I can make an active choice to be kind to myself in my thoughts. I do not have to be harsh or strict. I can simply choose to be my own friend. This takes a lot of the weight off when I am there for myself. Story 7. This little piggy went to market means that the little pig was sold for meat. I thought she was just doing her shopping. Story 8. I visited my childhood home when I was around 27, visiting my parents. I looked at the street sign and realized the name of the house I lived in from age 4 until college was spelled Somerset, with 1 M, instead of Somerset, with 2 M's. I had been misspelling my home address for nearly 2 decades. Story 9. I thought Elton John was Princess Diana's butler and became famous singing at her funeral. I came from a very sheltered home. Story 10. Everyone else is too caught up in their own lives to care about what you're doing. No one cares what you do with your life. This frees you to be yourself. I have lived with significant social anxiety since I was 15. I am now 29, and while I still struggle with it, it has definitely become easier knowing that no one is watching and critiquing me in public like I once thought. Story 11. When I was around 8 to 10, I visited Florida for the summer to see my grandma. We went to Applebee's, and she told me that the restaurant had a rule stating you couldn't eat there unless you were with your grandparents. I believed her. Fast forward to when I was 19. A couple of work friends wanted to go to Applebee's, and I genuinely laughed, telling them we couldn't go because no one had their grandparents with them. We all had a good laugh about it. Story 12. I stopped assuming that others would be unkind to me once I developed kinder thoughts about people. The change was significant. Story 13. I used to believe that success meant having a high salary and significant responsibilities, working long hours, and being highly qualified. However, I have realized that my version of success is feeling secure and having time to myself to engage in activities that bring me joy. I don't need a high salary to achieve that. Story 14. The song lyrics aren't, "Don't come around tonight, 'cause he's bound to take your life. There's a baboon on the right, but don't come around tonight. Well, it's bound to take your life. There's a bad moon on the rise." I used to sing it loudly and confidently. Story 15. It's never truly done. As a child, I thought adults lived a boring, calm life with nothing left to decide. However, I realized that's not the case. Story 16. I was somewhat of a bully during high school. I only realized it when someone positively commented on how I had stopped making fun of people. I still think about a couple of friends from school who immediately stopped talking to me after graduation, and I feel terrible about it. I have reached out to a few of them to apologize, but I haven't managed to contact all of them. Story 17. There was an old fruit canning factory in my hometown. Growing up, it was always just called the canning factory. I'm in the South, so saying canning factory with a Southern accent sounded to my young mind like cannon factory. It wasn't until I was an adult that I realized they canned fruit and didn't make weapons for pirate ships. Story 18. Every time I would get a new stick of deodorant, I had a difficult time removing the plastic cap. I always had to use my teeth because it was hard to get out. I was 26 when I realized I could just twist the deodorant up until the plug was completely out. Story 19. As a child, my dad told me about an animal called a side-hill gouger. It lived on the side of mountains and had legs that were shorter on one side, allowing it to stand upright. This came up in conversation many times as I grew up, and I never questioned it. One day, in my early 20s, I finally became aware enough to ask my dad what happens when it wants to change directions. I swear the man almost laughed too hard. Turns out it's a French fairy tale of sorts. Story 20. This is embarrassing. I was 30 when I realized that orchid, the plant, and orchard, where they grow fruit, are not pronounced the same. I used to laugh at people mispronouncing orchard and wondered why they pronounced this. Well, the joke was on me. Story 21. When I was about 6 or 7, my dad went to help my grandpa get a dead possum out of the shed. I tagged along because I had nothing else going on. They got the possum out of the shed and put it in the trash. I became upset that the possum wasn't getting a proper funeral. My dad told me that the garbage collectors would find the dead possum, bury it at the dump, and say a little prayer for it. That was good enough for me, and I went inside and had some cookies with my grandma. I was 26 when I realized that's not a service the garbage collectors offered. Story 22. When I was about 6, we got a hamster named Dick, a bit of a Houdini who liked to jump off the top of his 3-story cage. This eventually resulted in a trip to the vet, where we were surprised to learn that Dick was, in fact, female. We all had a good laugh, but she kept the name Dick. There was no heteronormativity in our house. A few years later, we noticed strange lumps on Dick's belly, which meant another trip to the vet. It turned out they were testicles. Dick was actually male after all. It wasn't until 30 years later that my mom casually mentioned in conversation that Dick was actually 3 hamsters that they had swapped out whenever one of them died. I had been thinking for 3 decades that I had an extraordinarily long-lived hamster. He would have been about 6 when he eventually died for the final time. I guess my mom finally thought I could handle the concept of death at 12 years of age. Story 23. I am very career-driven. I thought I wanted a partner who was also career-driven. Turns out that is not the case. My husband has a job he somewhat enjoys, but he has no career ambitions. His goals are entirely outside of work. This is the only reason it has been possible for me to pursue my career goals. When I was younger, I thought a lack of career ambition was the same as a lack of ambition. I actually broke up with my now spouse during our early 20s because of this. I'm so glad we found our way back to each other when I had things more figured out. Story 24. Birds do not live in nests all year round. They use nests to raise their chicks, but most of the time they live among the trees. Story 25. Once you're fully grown, you no longer need to leave room for your toes when buying new shoes. I thought it was just to ensure a comfortable fit with some spare space for your feet when running. Until my late 20s, I was buying shoes half a size or a full size too big. Story 26. I realized in my 20s that Garfield has no reason to hate Mondays, since he doesn't have to go to work or school. Story 27. My dad has a skin tag on his ear, but he always called it a dingleberry. I was talking with a friend when I heard them say, "Dingleberry," and I proudly exclaimed, "My dad has one of those on his ear." The look on my friend's face and the questions that followed were both hilarious and mortifying. I quickly called my dad and said, "What the heck, Dad?" We still laugh about it. Story 28. If you never want to ruin a pair of underwear with period stains again, just buy black underwear. I have spent many years having regular menstrual cycles to have only figured that out a few years ago. Story 29. The majestic white doves released at events were not wild birds being set free in a nice moment. but homing pigeons that could not wait to return home for supper. I was well into my 30s. Story 30. K9 is not a code or an abbreviation for a division within police departments. It is a play on the word canine. Story 31. I'm learning things about myself in my 60s. For instance, I've always been anxious, but I thought it was driven by external factors like work schedules and management. Now that I'm retired, I'm more anxious than ever, and it turns out that the source of my anxiety was internal. There are also many traits of mine that relate directly to my newly understood neurodivergence. You would think I would have known a lot of this earlier. Story 32. The album title, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, resonated with me when I was 28. It took me 14 years to reach that realization. Story 33. It is much easier to use a fork to retrieve a pickle from the bottom of a nearly empty, narrow-necked pickle jar than to use a knife. Story 34. My grandparents were children of immigrants and were originally raised with the culture and languages of their parents' countries of origin. Growing up, it was incredibly hard for them to integrate because they barely knew English or American customs. As a result, they decided to speak only English going forward and raise my parents as American as they could, without teaching them the languages they originally spoke. Therefore, I was raised speaking only English, and occasionally my parents would say a phrase or two they had picked up, explaining to little me that it was a different language spoken by my grandparents but now lost. Yet when I was in elementary and middle school, I would say certain words, and my classmates or teachers would give me a funny look and stare until I clarified what I meant, thinking I had pronounced it incorrectly or stuttered. This occurred often throughout my life. Even my partner would sometimes ask what I meant, only to conclude they had never heard that word before, and I was using an obscure English synonym. In my late 20s, I was in an ethnic grocery store when a mother was talking to her child in Polish. Later, another couple was speaking Czech. I stood there in shock as I heard them say a handful of words I had been saying all my life, words I had believed were English and used with friends, co-workers, and even strangers. It turned out my parents didn't always clarify when they used the very few Polish and Czech words they had heard from my grandparents. They assumed I just knew it wasn't English. I wasn't even saying them properly in the original languages. I had absolutely butchered them. No wonder people looked at me like I had two heads. Story 35. When people or books mentioned Vietnam veterans, I thought until my 30s that they were individuals who had gone to Vietnam to care for sick animals. Story 36. I believed you weren't allowed to go to Chuck E. Cheese unless you were invited to a birthday party. My parents told me that, which is why we never went. I was 25 driving past one, and I told my friends how disappointing it was that I was never invited to a birthday party there as a kid. They looked at me like I was insane. Apparently, you can just go to Chuck E. Cheese. I called my parents, and I think they were laughing hard. Story 37. My husband just learned that a pony is a separate animal and not a term for a baby horse. He just turned 26. Story 38. When I was very little, I had a much-loved doll named Posy. One day, my mother told me Posy wasn't well and had to go to the doll hospital. For months, I waited, and eventually, she came back, looking as good as new. Even her cheeks were rosy again. Fast forward to my 20s. I was on a late-night road trip with my mother when it suddenly popped into my head that there was no doll hospital. I confronted my mother, who laughed heartily. Apparently, the doll was in poor condition and falling apart. When I kept asking when she would return from the hospital, my mother had to get a new one, which took a long time. I still feel deceived. Essentially, all my childhood games involved doll hospitals for years. Story 39. A little bit earlier than my late 20s, during my junior year of college, my roommate ran out of laundry detergent. I offered her some of mine, handing her the container of fabric softener. She looked confused and asked if I had actual detergent. I told her it was in her hand, and that's when I learned that fabric softener is not the same as detergent. Growing up, my mom always bought both detergent and fabric softener, so when I finally shopped for myself, I only picked the cheap options that smelled really good. For almost 3 years in college, I washed my clothes with fabric softener only. We still talk about it a decade later. Story 40. I had no idea spices were organized alphabetically at the grocery store. I would just stand there like an idiot going through the entire inventory of spices, praying for the seasoning I needed to show itself. Story 41. This has to do with a medical term in German, which is my mother tongue. You may or may not know that Germans love their compound words. In German, a slipped or herniated disc is called Bandscheibenvorfall. Bandscheibe is the word for spinal disc. Vorfall can be translated to incident, but in this case, Vorfall is actually a compound of the words vor and fall, which roughly translates to slipped out of place. So, Bandscheibenvorfall just means that your disc slipped out of place in very much the same way the English term does. I just never realized it because I was so focused on Vorfall meaning incident, and I always thought it was such an odd name for a medical condition. I was 36 when I finally realized it. Story 42. I thought the song lyrics of Hey Jude said, Hey Jew, until my early 20s and was very confused as to why nobody had an issue with that. Story 43. I definitely didn't take care of my teeth in my younger years. Not only is it embarrassing, but it also feels foolish trying to improve them in my late 30s. Story 44. Chests of drawers, named after the designer, are often mispronounced. I never realized I was supposed to say chest of drawers. Story 45. This one is very specific to the UK and my generation. When I was a kid, there was a man named Dermot O'Leary who was one of the biggest television personalities for a while. Around the same time, many companies were moving away from animal testing. I heard a lot of television advertisements and could have sworn that dermatologically tested was Dermot O'Leary has tested. As a young boy with no need for makeup or moisturizers, I didn't realize the difference when I saw it written down at 20. Story 46. If a packet of instant soup is upside down and all the powder is at the wrong end, you can just open the wrong end. I have always tipped it the right way and tapped the powder down. It did not even occur to me that this was unnecessary until this week. I am 35. Story 47. I was working at a kindergarten and noticed adults manipulating children all the time, saying things like, "Put these toys away. You were so good at it." Kids believed it and did everything they were told. I just laughed. There was no way that would work on me. Then I realized I wasn't better at brewing coffee. My mom just used it to make me brew coffee for her every morning. I was so proud of my coffee brewing skills at the ripe age of 26. Story 48. Legalizing euthanasia did not mean that young people living in Asia were currently illegal. Story 49. When I was younger and people told me they got something that fell off a truck, I was surprised and thought, wow, what timing to be there when it fell off that truck. Story 50. You have to buy 2 rings when you get married? I met the love of my life and spent 2 years saving for a ring. I bought the ring and proposed to my wife. The next day after proposing, my brand new fiancé asked when we would look for the wedding ring. I was so confused because it was on her finger. I found out that there is an engagement ring and a wedding ring. Not a single person told me that you have to buy 2 rings when you get married. I didn't have any more money, so the wedding ring was thin and inexpensive. We have been together for 17 years. Story 51. I just realized how emotionally unstable I was in my early 20s, and that was quite embarrassing. Thank goodness for psychedelics and therapy. Story 52. I thought vampires drank through their fangs like using a straw. Spoiler, they don't. They use their fangs to crack the skin, causing the victim to bleed. It is much more brutal than I imagined. Story 53. Elton John's song Crocodile Rock includes the line about rock music fading away, but the years went by and rock just died. I mistakenly thought he was singing about a dog named Rock, and the idea of him dying always made me very sad. Story 54. I went to the dentist in my late 30s, and she said, "Oh, you have a bone." I had no clue what she meant. I apparently have a bone in the roof of my mouth, also called a torus palatinus. I was shocked. The dentist was surprised that I was surprised. My entire life, I thought everyone had this hump in the roof of their mouth, and that it was normal. After the appointment, I immediately called my parents because I could not believe it. My mom said she has it, my dad didn't, and neither did my sisters. Apparently, I was the only one who didn't know it was a thing. It has been a few years, and now I seriously question if my normal is normal. Does everyone see the color red like I do? There's been a downward spiral. Story 55. I grew up in a house with well water and a sump pump, so whenever the power went out, we couldn't flush the toilet. Fast forward to my college dorm, where I found myself yelling at people to stop flushing during a power outage. Story 56. The characters on Sesame Street were portrayed by actors. Bob, Maria, Gordon, and Mr. Hooper were not their real names. I wish I were joking. Bert and Ernie, Oscar, and Elmo played themselves, of course. Story 57. The word month is derived from the word moon. This was a significant revelation because I had previously observed that the moon cycle was approximately a month long, but I failed to recognize that the length of the month is an arbitrary decision about how to measure time based on that lunar cycle. Story 58. I thought that adults had things figured out by at least their 30s. Yet many people are just navigating life without a clear plan until the end. Story 59. Ground spices, such as ground pepper and ground cinnamon, are spices that have been processed into a powder. They are not a different variety of the spice that is grown in the soil. Story 60. Only women will understand this, but I was 35 when I realized that you're not supposed to put tampons down the toilet. I always thought when they said not to discard them down the toilet that they meant the cardboard piece on the outside, and I was always like, well, yeah, that'll ruin the plumbing for sure. It turns out the gross blood part that's inside you also isn't supposed to go in the toilet. I've been damaging local plumbing for the last 25 years. I've become a strong advocate against any cleaning staff who suggests that women's bathrooms are dirtier to clean than men's. If you set it up properly for us, then we'll keep it clean. You try to pull a little cotton tube out of your body, wrap it in toilet paper, and then find a disposal can, they're always broken, without getting blood on yourself or anything around you. It's incredibly difficult. Story 61. I found out that I am autistic. I thought I was high masking and flying under the radar. Everyone else knew or highly suspected, but I was the last to realize. It is very embarrassing, but it is kind of nice that my friends knew and still love me for who I am. Story 62. Marvin the Martian was expecting an earth-shattering kaboom, not because earth-shattering means really loud, but because he was trying to blow up the earth. Story 63. That making ends meet wasn't making ends meet. I thought the best part of a roast was the ends, and if you had ends meet, you were doing well. Story 64. When I was in high school band, we sometimes held a car wash as a fundraiser. I would show up in my cutoffs and bikini top, ready to wash cars. Each time, I was sent out to the Boulevard Median to hold the sign and advertise, as this was the 80s and we had no social media. I never washed a single car. In my 30s, I passed one of those car washes and had a sudden realization. I wore a DD bra in high school. Of course, I was the one sent out to hold the sign. I'm not sure why I didn't realize it at the time. I shared this revelation with one of my best friends from high school, and she laughed at me. I've always been a bit oblivious. Story 65. What fainting is. I told my doctor that I get dizzy every time I stand up. She asked if I experience fainting, and I said no. However, each time I stand up, my vision fades to black. I hear ringing in my ears, my heart flutters, and my body feels heavy. She stared at me for a few seconds in the longest silence of my life before telling me, "That's fainting. You are fainting every time you stand up." I told her I thought fainting involved falling, but she said not necessarily. So at 26, I learned what fainting actually was and that I have postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Story 66. I was around 34 years old when I found out there was more than one football game per week. I'm not a football fan, but most of my boyfriends throughout my life have been, and they would all talk about the game. Then they would sit down and watch it. I thought the game referred to the one match professional footballers played each week, with two teams competing. It makes sense that they wouldn't say, "I'm going to watch my team play the one game they're going to play this week, and I'm not going to watch any of the other games all the other teams are playing." But it didn't help my misconception. Story 67. When I was in my early 30s, I was on a long car ride with my cousins, who were about 15 and 12. We were playing the category game where someone says a word, and you have to use the last letter of that word to come up with your word. Our category was animals. We played for a while and started having trouble coming up with new animals. One of my cousins said unicorn, and we all agreed to let it count, even though it is a mystical creature, not a traditional animal. When my turn came up, I needed an animal that began with the letter N. I said, well, since we are including mythical animals, I'm going to go with narwhal. Turns out narwhals are real. That unicorn-like horn is just very misleading. Story 68. This is embarrassing. About 4 years ago, when I was 34, my coworkers were discussing Alaska, and I asked, how long does it take to fly there? I was in the United States at the time. I mistakenly believed the map they showed us, which had the continental United States, Hawaii, and Alaska boxed in the bottom left corner, was accurate. Why did they present it that way? Story 69. Wind turbines generate electricity from kinetic energy. They do not create electricity from any magical property of the wind. Story 70. That the 25-year-old man who tried to connect with me when I was 16 was not actually surprised when I told him I was under 18. I always thought he believed I was older. Story 71. I was in my mid-30s when I realized that Sir Mix-a-Lot did not actually have a pet snake that liked to eat buns. Story 72. The chicken crossed the road to get to the other side. The other side is a well-known euphemism for the afterlife. I was not aware of this until my 30s when I finally realized why that joke is supposed to be funny. Story 73. If something makes you miserable, you can stop doing it. If something brings you joy, you can continue doing it. Story 74. As a child, I often attended football matches at night with my father, which were illuminated by huge screens as the sky grew darker. Back in the 1970s, there was only one television in the house, and I would listen to the very boring football results every Saturday night before Doctor Who. The commentary was like, he scored 3 goals, a prince among men. The scores were read out like this: Wigan Athletic 1, Stoke City 0, Manchester United 6, Leyton Orient 4. I had never heard of Orient, so in the Christmas song, We Three Kings of Orient Are. I thought these were 3 very good footballers from the Orient team who had scored goals and played at night under the stars. However, I wasn't sure how this fitted with the nativity story. Story 75. Until my mid-20s, I was a pathological liar and I had to stop. I didn't tell anyone because I felt too ashamed, but I have not lied since realizing this. Sometimes the urge still arises, but the shame is stronger. Story 76. Apparently, the phrase, I have to see a man about a horse, means that you need to use the bathroom. I always thought it just meant, well, it was nice catching up. I have to take care of something. I can't tell you how many times I was in formal situations and would politely say, it was great meeting you all. I have to see a man about a horse. It's cringy when I think back on it now, but it certainly explains the often strange looks I received. Story 77. In my late teens, I realized I was awkward in high school, a situation many people face to varying degrees. I was at the top of my class and often tutored my classmates for free, expecting girls to show interest in return. It was a strange dynamic, though I wasn't hateful towards women. I still feel embarrassed about that time. In my early 20s, I had an eye-opening realization. While I was seeking a partner, I was insecure about my appearance and failed to reflect on my personality. Once I understood that you can be unattractive and still have relationships, and that the right people value your character over your looks, my perspective changed completely. I do feel as though I missed out on my youth by thinking that way for so long, and I often cringe at my younger self. Now, at 30, I'm thriving, but I still look back at those memories with some regret, wishing I had been more social. No regrets, just lessons learned from being a naive teenager. A side anecdote. When I was 19, I was on vacation in Japan and tried to flirt with someone at a bar. I knew a bit of Japanese and felt things were going well until my hay fever kicked in. I was sneezing the whole time we spoke. When she asked if I was okay, I attempted to say pollen allergy, but instead, I accidentally said, I'm horny. Due to the similar sounds in the language, she immediately moved to another seat, and I have never forgotten that moment. Story 78. Not in my late 20s or 30s, but in my late teens, I once commented to my mother, in front of all my older siblings, that she, a devout Catholic, must be really health conscious if she took her temperature daily since she always had a thermometer on her bedside table. There was an awkward pause before realization dawned, and everyone burst out laughing. Story 79. Loving someone else is the biggest gamble one can take. It can either be rewarding by providing a great support structure, or it can leave you with a lifelong scar to deal with. Story 80. Not everything is my fault. I'm not always the one who struggles with socializing or the enemy in every situation. Sometimes people can be manipulative and will hurt you, even if you are kind to them. You can do everything right and still be treated poorly, and it is not your fault. Story 81. In my late 30s, I have recently realized what an insufferable know-it-all I was in my 20s at work. No wonder I had problems with people. They weren't the problem, I was. Now, I work with individuals in their early 20s who behave like I did back then. I want to tell them to come talk to me 10 years from now. We will revisit this situation, and they will understand so much more than they think they understand now. Story 82. If I ate octopus, it would make me very sick. My parents didn't want me to eat it, and I'm glad now because I don't think they are meant for human consumption. They are far too intelligent. Story 83. I was unkind to my friends in high school. None of us were particularly popular, but I realized at the time I didn't understand why everyone abandoned me during my senior year. About a year ago, I reached out to one of them and apologized. He responded by saying he has high school-age children who are unaware of the situation, so he understood my actions back then. Story 84. My father was from the Caribbean and had sayings we didn't fully understand. If we were up past bedtime, he would yell, "Chicken Mary, hawk is near." I grew up imagining a bird-like boogeyman that would fly away with us if we didn't go to sleep. I also conflated this with the chicken hawk from Foghorn Leghorn, which made me laugh even more. My siblings had a somewhat similar image in mind. After he died, while chatting with relatives at the funeral, I learned he was saying, "Chicken Mary, hawk is near." I could barely stop laughing as I explained to my siblings that it was just another of his many sayings involving chickens. Story 85. Embarrassing? Don't worry. Facebook memories keep reminding me what a jerk I was all throughout 2008 to 2020. Weird status updates, cringeworthy writing, and poking friends. Story 86. There's a song. Papa was a rolling stone. Wherever he laid his hat was his home. I thought the next line was, and when he died, all he left us was alone. But it's actually a loan. How do you repay a loan to a dead man? Story 87. I drove for 10 years before realizing there is an arrow on the gas gauge that indicates which side the gas tank is on. Story 88. Many people wipe without standing up. I never knew this was possible or how to do it effectively. I'm 6 feet 4 inches tall, and I can lean to the side to wipe, but it's not as effective as standing up and bending over. Story 89. I have been living with post-traumatic stress disorder since I was 17 years old. I am almost 40. And it is not just something that happens to active-duty military personnel. I experienced many frightening events at a young age and had no understanding of mental health. So, I kept pushing myself forward, thinking that was just how my brain worked. Fast forward to more distressing experiences in my mid-30s that led to serious unraveling, but this time someone recommended talking to a professional. That was excellent advice. The stress response due to extreme trauma seems so obvious now. Story 90. I just found out that everyone else reads Wild Cherry Pepsi as referring to cherries grown in the wild. My entire life, I thought it was about the cherries having a wild night out or something. I think I probably figured this out in my late teens, but when I was a kid, my mom had to get a mammogram, so she brought my brother and me and had us wait in the waiting room. The clinic was next to a Hooters, and I assumed the sign outside was for that. So for most of my youth, I believed that Hooters was a chain of mammogram clinics that, for some reason, chose to feature barely clothed women in all their advertisements. Story 91. When adults say, "Everyone thinks they are different, it's normal," they often overlook those who are undiagnosed with autism. Story 92. I have always believed what my boyfriend said and went along with his hobbies and decisions. I wish I had stood up for myself more. Story 93. The UK television soap opera called EastEnders is named after the East End of London. I spent my childhood and teenage years watching it every night with my family. Then, one day in my late 20s, after not watching it for 6 years, it just clicked. Story 94. I used to think that when book characters such as inmates were served bread and water, it would be some kind of soup made of wet bread. But I realized this earlier than my 20s. I thought it was not normal to fart. In my 20s, I found out that the average person farts 8 times per day. I understood that you actually do learn from mistakes in my 30s. Mistakes are necessary and a completely normal part of life. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.